We will continue. We have a very prominent speaker. I would like to welcome the leader of the Labour Party of the UK, please. Jeremy Corbyn. I really expected participation here in the PES. A source of inspiration for many young people in Europe, in the UK and beyond, and what we all expected, the next Prime Minister of the UK. Thank you, Jeremy. Jeremy Corbyn, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me some time here to speak today, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here amongst comrades and friends from socialist parties and parties in government all across Europe. And it's not only a special privilege to be here in Portugal, where a socialist-led government bringing together parties and movements across the left and the Labour movements have successfully turned the tide against austerity and rejected neoliberal orthodoxies and the economics of it that have failed our people for so long, both in Europe and across the world. And I would just say that last weekend I had the great pleasure of travelling to Mexico for the inauguration of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the first socialist president of Mexico, elected with a landslide majority, with a huge mandate to end neoliberal economics, to drive out corruption and end the human rights crisis in Mexico. I think we need to send Andrés Manuel our full support from socialists all across Europe. Since I was first elected leader of our party, the British Labour Party, in 2015, I have made a very strong personal commitment, and my party has, to build closer ties with our European sister parties and progressive movements across our continent. I make it a very high priority, because we meet at a time of political crisis in Britain, when the Conservative government's failure to negotiate a good Brexit agreement that works for all of our people has put our common future in the balance. But I want to make this very clear before I say anything else. Labour is committed to remaining a full member of the Party of European Socialists now and in the future. Because inside or outside the European Union, we are internationalists to our very core. That is what socialism is about. As socialists and trade unionists, we will work together to build a real social Europe, a people's Europe, a Europe that will strengthen solidarity across borders and resist the whole concept of the race to the bottom in rights and protection at work. Together, we extend those rights to all workers and consumers, and the crucial issues of protection of our natural world and our environment, which cannot be done solely within national borders. We have to recognise that European Union support for austerity and failed neoliberal economics have caused serious hardship for working people across Europe. In my own country, there's been effectively a wage freeze for 10 years. It's damaged the credibility of the European social model and social democratic parties and played a significant role in the vote for Brexit in Britain. Please understand that those people that voted for Brexit in Britain, I voted to remain, I campaigned to remain and reform. They voted because they were angry at the situation they were in, with frozen wages, poor working conditions, and a sense that their communities that had lost their industries had been left behind. There are places like that all over Europe where people feel angry at the economic failure to provide hope, particularly for the young generation. European socialists have to fight for a different kind of Europe. Our prize is a new progressive economic consensus that breaks with the failed market dogmas of the past and secures shared prosperity built on a powerful public realm. We must build a new Europe, both inside and outside the institutions of the European Union, that really does work for the many, not the few. And although Britain voted to leave the European Union in 2016, we in the Labour Party are going to work with you and other progressive parties and movements to improve people's lives across the whole continent. In that referendum, as I said, we argued Remain and Reform, believing that by staying inside the EU, we could help shift the Union towards a more genuinely social Europe, help to loosen the corporate grip on the EU's agenda and reform some of the more restrictive market-driven regulations that exist in Europe. But in a country, my country, where 1 million families, get that, 1 million families are using food banks and 4 million children are living in poverty. And as I said earlier, real wages lower than they were in 2010, a majority of people, a small majority, voted to leave the EU. We have to respect the result of that referendum. It's our job to shape what comes next. At the heart of our approach is a determination to put jobs and the economy at first, to maintain the closest trading relationships, and to protect the rights of each other's citizens. Stand firm, absolutely stand firm against xenophobia and racism, and promote a shared prosperity. We defeat the far right with our solidarity across the whole continent, as well as in our own countries. There is no solution offered by the far right that will help anyone that's poor, anyone that's up against it, or any community that's been left behind. You only deal with those problems by socialism, by socialist policies, and by investment in the future of people. You don't sort out these problems by blaming vulnerable minorities and setting off a whole tide of hate against people who themselves are very, very vulnerable. Unfortunately, I have to say, the Brexit deal negotiated between the European Union and the British Conservative government doesn't deliver anything close to what is needed. It's a bad deal that will make most people in Britain worse off and risks undercutting rights and standards across Europe. In the past 2.5 years, the British government has spent more time negotiating with different factions of the Conservative Party than with the European Union. Indeed, they've had 3 Brexit secretaries in 2 years, which is some kind of record. One of them barely visited Europe anyway. They've been setting red lines and then reflect that there is no consensus on them, and then systematically crossing them, one after the other. And now the Prime Minister has signed up to an agreement which has united all of the opposition parties in our Parliament and both Leave and Remain supporters amongst our own Conservative MPs. As things stand, it looks likely to be rejected in Parliament in the House of Commons on Tuesday. So now, facing defeat, Theresa May is reduced to threatening economic chaos and crashing out without any deal as her best chance of survival, a kind of Project Sphere that's been offered. It's a reckless and it's an irresponsible strategy. A no-deal Brexit would not only do serious damage to the UK, but would have an unpredictable and very damaging consequences all across Europe. It must be avoided at all costs by all sides, and we will make sure there is no situation where we crash out with no deal. A better deal, both for Britain and Europe, is, I believe, both desirable and possible. Further negotiations are a small price to pay to get a solution that works for all of us. We are confident that our alternative plan could command a majority in the British Parliament and bring our country together and unlock the negotiations for our future relationships. A new comprehensive customs union with a British say in future trade deals, combined with a new strong relationship with the single market, would strengthen our manufacturing centre and give us a solid base for industrial renewal under the next Labour government, especially, as I pointed out, for what I call the held-back communities in many parts of my country. People that are now living poor lives, living with the prospect of having very little income because they have a 0 hours contract and often doing 2 or 3 jobs just to try and make ends meet. And so a Labour government would change things. It would remove the threat to different parts of the UK being subject to separate regulations. A new strong relationship with the single market that gives us frictionless trade to rebuild our economy and expand our public services, while setting migration policy that meets the needs of the economy, not fueling xenophobia and false immigration targets. It makes far more sense to me than the Prime Minister's dismal deal. Finally, we want to see a guarantee that all the existing rights at work, environmental standards, consumer protections, will become a benchmark to build on, not something to fall behind and try to undercut the achievements of people to improve working conditions in other countries. I don't want my country to become some kind of bargain basement on the edge of Europe. I want full rights and protections equally all across this continent. These rights and protections, whether on chlorinated chicken or paid holidays or what people actually want to eat, are very, very important. But our government is determined to sell them off in a race to the bottom. That's why we have these very different set of priorities. Our alternative plan would ensure an open border in Ireland and provide security for investment and give our manufacturing sector the renewal that it needs, and ensure that we have the powers in our economy to build a public say on services and guarantee that we get good working conditions and environmental protections in our country. So I was looking forward on Sunday night to having a head-to-head debate with Theresa May. She offered one, I accepted it, and we're not having it. So we agreed to the debate, but unfortunately when it came to it last time in our general election, she didn't want to have a debate, and yesterday the debate for Sunday night was cancelled. So it's not going to happen. So we'll put our message out in the best ways that we can. But given that her botched deal would have a major impact on our country's future and our relationship, this is the very last time for Theresa May to dodge scrutiny. The Conservatives see Brexit as an opportunity to turn Britain into a deregulated tax haven on the shores of Europe. In the Brexit withdrawal agreement, the clause is committing the UK to maintain workers' rights and environmental protections and was specifically excluded from the enforcement mechanism. As the British Attorney General boasted to the House of Commons on Monday, this gives the UK what he called flexibility. But flexibility for whom? Flexibility for employers to exploit workers, flexibility for big corporations to pollute our environment, flexibility for multinational giants to undercut the rest of Europe and drive down standards everywhere. Labour stands for the very opposite. We want Britain to be a world leader in workers' rights. That's what the Labour Party was founded for. And on protections for consumers. And on protections for consumers and our environment too. That's why, under our plan, the UK would not only maintain existing standards and would keep pace with future improvements, but go beyond them, go far beyond them. This is the real social Europe that we want to build, locking in progressive change irrespective of the events of the next few days, because we have a common progressive project. That's what unites us all here today in Lisbon, in this wonderful hall. A taste of what it means in practice, and we don't have to look very far. When we work together, when we challenge economic orthodoxy, when we challenge austerity, things change. It was here in Portugal the spell of austerity in Europe was broken. After years of being told there was no alternative to cutting public services, slashing wages, selling off public assets, a government was elected here in 2015, pledged to turn the page on austerity. And despite all the predictions of doom and gloom from all the usual quarters, I pay huge tribute to Antonio Costa's government, which has defied all expectations. Defied all those expectations and shown there is a better way. I want also to pay tribute to the Portuguese left. I first met the Portuguese left in the 1970s, fighting to throw off the yoke of the oppression that was there before. I pay tribute to the Portuguese Socialist Party and the parties supporting Antonio Costa in government. Because it's been an alliance of progressive forces that has made it possible to start to turn the tide on what we all now accept is the failed austerity economics. We need to extend that approach across the continent to create a real social Europe that works for the many, not the few. Labour's commitment is summed up in our message, for the many, not the few. It embodies an approach to politics that speaks to the large majority representing their interests, in opposition to a wealthy and powerful few who are blocking progress and holding people back. We can no longer pretend the aspirations of the many can be met without challenging the power and privilege of the elite. The model followed by many left-of-centre parties before the great crash of 2008 was based on the calculation that if powerful forces at the pinnacle of the economy were left undisturbed, they would tolerate a measure of redistribution further down the pecking order. That was underpinned by an acceptance of the economic legacy left to us, sadly, in the 1970s and 80s by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And it was a retreat from the idea that governments can intervene to support their citizens. These views were on both sides of the Atlantic, from the ravages of the global markets. Nowhere was this model embraced more enthusiastically, sadly, than in my own country, in Britain. But though that delivered electoral success before the crash, large parts of the population, as I've said, especially in communities that traditionally voted socialist and for social democratic parties, were losing faith in a system that no longer worked for them. In towns and cities, hollowed out by industrial decline and neglect, the promised benefits of deregulated markets and privatisation sounded like a cruel joke, where good, well-paid jobs were replaced with insecure employment or no work at all. Our communities felt their dignity had been stolen and their pride stripped away. And all the time, they watched the wealth of the very richest balloon and grow bigger and bigger. But when the 2008 crash came, the response of the political establishment was to double down and unleash austerity and programs that hit the poorest the hardest. Those least to blame for the crisis suffered the most for it, suffering and multiplying and deepening the sense of disillusionment amongst those communities. In the post-crash world, the model that many social democratic parties had adopted no longer works, and we have to think about that. The evidence of that has been mounting in polling stations across the continent for a decade. So when we say we stand for the many, not the few, we're sending a message that we will address the obscene concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a tiny corporate elite across this continent and indeed across the world. And as socialists, we will challenge the failed economic orthodoxy that has fueled that inequality and created chronic insecurity in the workplace. Our policies, all of us, will bring about a real change. We not only want radical redistribution of wealth, we also want to restructure our economy to put power into the hands of workers and consumers. We need to think outside the box. We will bring, in Britain, utilities genuinely into democratic public ownership by doubling the size of our cooperative sector and introduce mandatory inclusive ownership funds to large companies so that workers get a share of the wealth they create. Many of these ideas are to the horror of the establishment, but they're actually very popular. They're helping to shape a new consensus in my country and well beyond, just as we're learning from experiences here in Portugal and elsewhere. It's up to all of us to secure a new economic settlement that breaks from the flawed thinking of the past and creates a real social Europe that we all aspire to. The stakes could not be higher. If we cannot rise to the task, then we will stoke the path to power of the fake populists. As I said earlier, the far right feeds on fears fueled by falling living standards, damaged communities, insecure work, and underfunded public services. It diverts the blame away from the powerful few responsible for the economic and social failure and onto those vulnerable minorities, hard-working, vulnerable minorities, vulnerable people who get abused because the far right think that's the solution to everyone's problems. Everywhere, that strategy is depressingly familiar. Divide society, isolate those identified as different, be they Muslims, Jews, Roma, disabled, the unemployed, anyone with faith, identity, sexuality, or a way of life that marks them out in any way as different to what is seen as their norm. It's often the most desperate people in society, refugees, who have to bear the brunt of it. On Monday, we will mark Human Rights Day. It'll be 70 years since the proclamation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a remarkable historic document which affirms the right of everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from. It was a crucial milestone. But sadly, the horrors of war, famine, and violent occupation have not gone away. There are now more refugees and displaced people in the world than at any point since that declaration was signed in 1948. We must remember that refugees are people, just like you and just like me. But unlike us, they've been forced by violence, persecution, or climate destruction and environmental devastation to flee their homes. Men, women, and children are dying on the borders of Europe, dying in the Mediterranean, dying on the coasts. Our criticisms of Donald Trump and Viktor Orban for building walls and putting up razor wire lose their force if we too are raising barriers against those in desperate need. The right will always find a scapegoat. The left must find solutions that deliver real change. If the European political establishment carries on with business as usual, the fake populists of the right will fill the vacuum. The biggest issues facing humanity demand that we work together. How else can we confront the destruction of our climate, which is creating instability and fueling conflict around the world? Our whole planet is in jeopardy. Climate destruction is undeniable. Sea levels are already rising, and the number of natural disasters each year has quadrupled since 1970. The UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, recently said the climate crisis is a global issue and we're all failing. Friends, this makes it even more urgent that we offer people a genuine alternative, united against bigotry, xenophobia and division, and for solidarity and internationalism, and an economy that allows everyone to reach their potential. In my country, the Tory party, their policies pose a challenge to all of us. But Labour has the values and the determination to meet that challenge, based on our determination to cooperate with our neighbours rather than shut ourselves off and be against them, and driven by our ambition to build a real social Europe that spans the continent, both inside and outside the European Union. A Europe for the many, not the few. That is our challenge. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. Nice to see you. Lovely to see you.